Hi, I wanted to talk about the RMS Titanic. One of the least understood disasters in our history, although one of the most talked about, um, reenacted, used in movies, in novels, and in various social commentaries. The RMS Titanic has become a metaphor for disaster or trouble or problems. But the thing is about the RMS Titanic is there's an awful lot of good about the ship that we don't talk about. There's an awful lot about the ship that was great that we don't talk about. And a lot of the stuff that we do talk about are basically misinformed pieces of information that have been passed down over time. Let's go right back to the beginnings. The RMS Titanic was not a single ship. It was one of three ships, initially to be called the Olympic, the Titanic, and what is said, the Gigantic. All of them dealt with massive size. It was all about size. They were the brainchild of J. Bruce Ismay, who was the kind of puppet head of the White Star Line. The White Star Line was owned by J.P. Morgan at this time. And so the deal was with White Star was to make all of their ships at Harland and Wolff. That was the shipyard that made all of White Star's ships. And so the dream that would become the Titanic was developed by White Star and also with a great deal of assistance from Harland and Wolff. The RMS Titanic was never said to be unsinkable. She was said to be practically unsinkable. With that being said, so was the Olympic said to be practically unsinkable. If we go through time, let's go back to the Adriatic. It was said to be practically unsinkable. Let's look at the Lusitania. It was said to be practically unsinkable. Let's look at the Mauretania. It was said to be practically unsinkable. This is an overused term. The problem with the RMS Titanic and why we get this unsinkable information constantly about it was this. The first of this trio of ships was the RMS Olympic. Good chance you've never heard of it. Most people have not. Only people that know about ships are familiar with the RMS Olympic. It was the first of the Olympic class put out by White Star. These were the three ships that were going to be basically identical and that would create a wonderful back and forth regular like train trip across the Atlantic. That was the idea, with some regularity, with great comfort. And the Olympic was the millionaire special. The Olympic was the ship of dreams. The Olympic was this incredible vessel that everyone had to see, that everyone wanted to see, that all the millionaires wanted to get on, that the press could not get enough information about. And the Olympic made its maiden voyage, and everyone was checking to see what was going on all the way until it reached New York City. And there was as much excitement in New York City when it arrived as there had been during the voyage. And so the Olympic became the star. The Olympic became the ship Wonderful. Then came the second ship. As everyone knows, when you start something new, everyone gets excited about the first. And no one could really give a damn about the second. And that's what happens with the RMS Titanic. No one's jumping up and down about the Titanic. No one's writing about it much at all. The press isn't really concerned. The wealthy don't really pay much attention. It's just another Olympic. Yeah, no big deal. You know, I went through tons of newspapers searching in February, March, and April of 1912, and there is sparse information about the RMS Titanic. No one was talking about it. Go back a year to the Olympic, and no one can stop talking about it. Pages and pages and pages of information. You might say they kind of blew their wad. And nobody was interested in talking about another Olympic. And so the Titanic was not booked extremely heavily at all. In fact, the only reason she had more passengers on board was because of a coal strike. And several other ships gave their passengers to the Titanic. And even with that, the Titanic was not even 2/3 full of her compartment of passengers. Now, we often hear about the Titanic and its lifeboats, that since it was unsinkable, it didn't need lifeboats. Well, that's a bunch of hooey. The Titanic had more lifeboats than the Lusitania. The Titanic had more lifeboats than the Mauretania. The Titanic had more lifeboats than many other ships. Granted, it was larger, but a lot of these smaller ships carried the same amount of passengers. You got to remember that one of the great things about those ships years ago was the fact that they carried immigrants. Immigrants were the most profitable people to carry on an ocean liner. And so every ocean liner was designed to carry tons of immigrants, sometimes up to 2,000. And so these other ships carried a similar complement of people that the Titanic did, but they had less lifeboats. We don't hear that. We just keep hearing the fact that the Titanic didn't have that many lifeboats. She certainly didn't have enough. No ship had enough, except for the Germans. The Germans seemed to have a lot more lifeboats on their ships. But the English weren't talking to the Germans in those days. They were battling over the blue ribbon. Now, another thing that's very important about the RMS Titanic, and that is what it did when it had its accident. We often hear the story when we watch in the movie that came out, in the many movies before. You hear iceberg ahead, and there's this slow period of time as they're slowly turning the ship, and it's slowly turning away from the iceberg. They didn't have time to do much of anything. People don't realize the fact that they saw that iceberg very late, and it's just a handful of seconds. We're talking about maybe 20, 25, maybe 30 seconds at most till they hit that iceberg. 30 seconds isn't much time. And when a ship is doing 22 knots, there's not much you can do. They don't turn on a dime. You know, ocean liners need 1,000, 2,000 feet to turn. And so we're talking about a much smaller amount of space than that. Another thing is, when the Titanic was sinking, who was getting on, who was getting off, what was happening? Well, a lot of people didn't get into the lifeboats. A lot of people sat there and felt that the ship was safer. And of course, this myth about its unsinkability is troubling, because White Star never stated that the Titanic was unsinkable, but it was inferred. And it was a more innocent age back then. And so people refused to get onto the lifeboats, and they just lowered them away. In fact, in many cases, they were afraid that the lifeboats would buckle if they put too many people in them. Well, they had been tested, but nobody knew that. So about 705 people escaped. They get out into the water, and they all have lanterns to light up their ships. And what do? They put out their lights. Why? So the people that are swimming in the water can't find them and swamp their ships. There's lots of stuff that happened with the Titanic. It was a terrible night. I don't see why a lot of people find it so romantic. It was one of the worst nights in the history of transportation.